This was an election where the Liberal heartland, as it had been understood since the time of Robert Menzies, turned on it in a savage and unprecedented fashion, and it delivered an election result, the contours of which we have never before seen. A lot of sort of tinder has been building up over the years that led into this conflagration. Back in, I think, 2004 election, there was a lot of talk back then that there was going to be a huge rebellion by the doctors' wives. Were going to emerge against John Howard, and a bit of a sexist terminology. It's dropped out of use, but this was the buzzword that people were using to describe this new phenomenon of politically progressive, wealthy voters in the kinds of seats that had been represented historically by members like Bob Menzies, Harold Holt, etc. They were going to rise up and give John Howard a sting where he wasn't expecting to feel it. Didn't really happen. It did if you looked very closely at the election results, though. I remember going into the 2007 election, there was a lot of talk that Joe Hockey might lose his seat of North Sydney to Labor. Didn't happen, bit of a fizzer. Nonetheless, there was a big swing against him in that seat, so people went from kind of overindulging the notion to being overly dismissive of it because it didn't meet expectations. Nonetheless, if you look carefully at the results of those late Howard period elections, there were movements away relative to the rest of the country in the sorts of seats that are now Teal independent seats. And back then, the talk was that what was fueling it was you had the Iraq War, you had the refugee issue, you had Howard's refusal to sign the Kyoto Protocol. These were the first embers of the realignment that finally really kicked in very hard, I think even harder than the Liberals were anticipating at this election. So now we find a situation where so many what always would have been regarded as Liberals, blue ribbon Liberal seats, probably even most of them, are no longer held by the Liberal Party. 8 blue ribbon seats, broadly defined, are now held by crossbenchers. The 6 Teal independent seats won at this election, plus one that was already there, courtesy of Ali Steddle in Warringah, and I might throw Mayo, held by Rebecca Sharkey in Adelaide/South Australia, into that definition. And Ryan was lost to the Greens. So that's how it manifested at this election. Furthermore, if you burrow even deeper into the election results, you see some fascinating little factoids emerge, like the fact that Labor won the 2-party preferred vote in the seat of Mayo, Alexander Downer's old seat, now Rebecca Sharkey's seat. But when I say 2-party preferred, I mean when you strip all candidates other than Liberal and Labor out of the count, there were more ballot papers in Mayo that had the Labor higher ahead of Liberal than vice versa. And that was something that, would never have occurred to Alexander Downer in his wildest nightmares that might happen. He did almost lose the seat to the Australian Democrats in 1998, but not, there would never have been any question of Labor being competitive in that seat. Labor won the seat of Higgins in Melbourne, which is, an absolutely classic, prestige Liberal Party seat, Peter Costello's seat. I think John Gorton was the member for Higgins. And, one of those seats where, you just didn't pay any attention to it on election night. It was a Liberal seat, blue ribbon, rock solid. Boothby in Adelaide, Labor have never won that seat before. Now they do, a seat that Labor had been knocking on the door of for a long time. It never quite seemed to get knocked over. Now it's there. So, a lot of seats, and as I will get to discussing eventually, the contours of this election victory look very different from those of last election victories, both in terms of seats, Liberals losing seats they'd never lost before, and holding on to seats that they typically lost at losing elections. So to burrow into this, a pre- and post-election survey by the Australian National University found that education rather than income was the operative variable here. They, to put it crudely, affluent tradies, Howard's sort of Australia, There was a lot of talk during John Howard's election victories, particularly after 2004, that we have a new class of sort of affluent tradesmen, trades workers in this country who are, in olden times would have earned less money, been blue collar and been Labor voters. Now they're affluent, they live in the outer suburbs, they don't necessarily have university degrees, but they have the economic motivations to vote Liberal, and they lack they're not part of the cultural rebellion against the Liberal Party among wealthier, more educated people that we saw at this election. It was highly educated people who have heavily abandoned the Liberal Party at this election, and that rather than income, if you go into the nitty-gritty of who voted and how and why, it was more to an effect of education than an effect of income. Of course, more educated people tend to be better remunerated. But when you pick apart those two variables, education was the better predictor than income of the rebellion in the Teal seats, and indeed in seats like Higgins, where essentially the Liberal Party were abandoned. Nonetheless, if you do strip everything away and just look at income, my analysis found that for every $1,000 of median household weekly income in the area surrounding a polling booth added 4% to the swing against the Liberal Party. The typical median household weekly income is a bit below $2,000. So, say you've got an area where $2,000 is the median household weekly income, you've got another area where it's $3,000. At this election, we would have expected the booth with the $3,000 to have swung 4% more against the Liberal Party than the $2,000 area. The next slide will go into how we don't want to go overboard like the poor old Financial Review did. The Financial Review had a headline in response to this saying, Labor voters earn more than coalition voters for the first time. They were heavily pilloried for this by people who knew what they were talking about on Twitter, and it discreetly rewrote the headline and elements of the article later that day. It is not the case that wealthy people are more inclined to vote Labor than Liberal now, and vice versa. What got the Financial Review confused was the good old ecological fallacy where you draw inferences about individual behaviour based on aggregate data. If you did that, you might think that in America, that Democrats were overwhelmingly rich and Republicans were dirt poor because Louisiana and Arkansas are deep red states, California and New York are deep blue states. The former are dirt poor, the latter are very rich. You might infer from that that the Democrats are the rich people party. Not the case, still not the case, even after the Trump alignment. So when you actually liberate yourself from the ecological fallacy and look at individual level data, of which I sadly have none available to me, but YouGov do, they did a massive survey during the election campaign of 16,000 voters, and post-election burrowed into this data and found that the basic pattern still holds. 44% of people who were on $150,000 a year or more and who were homeowners, which includes having a mortgage, they weren't renters, voted for the coalition, compared with about 35% altogether. Now, this is, historically speaking, a modest difference, but it's still there. I think if you went back, 30 or 40 years ago, the difference between the 150,000 plus demographic, inflation adjusted, with that of the overall median would have been bigger. But nonetheless, it is unmistakably still there, 44% compared with 35% among the kind of property owning elite. Among those on $50,000 or less who didn't own their homes, they got a mere 16% of the vote. They were outpolled by the Greens among that cohort. People who are on low incomes, who do not own their homes, do not feel any kind of stake at all in the Liberal Party unless they are part of the kind of cultural tribal right, which a couple of them are, I suppose. 16%, that's something I'll get into further, this property dimension, because it proved to be very important. The ANU found being in the bottom fifth on income associated positively with support for Labor. They did a similar study of their own survey data and found that there is still that association there, particularly at the lowest level of income. There remains an awareness among those in the bottom quartile of income that the Labor Party are going to look after their interests better than will the Liberal Party. The other demographic dimension that I think, well, actually, we've got a bunch of cross currents here in terms of the demographic dimensions of this result: income, property, education, age. They were the four demographic building blocks of this election result. And there's a lot of overlapping between them. Younger people tend to have lower incomes. They tend not to be homeowners. So each of these four variables feeds into the other to a certain extent, and there's a bit of work to be done disentangling them to see which of them actually made the difference, or whether or not in some sense they resulted in a kind of cultural unity between the different variables. What I would say is that the Conservatives in this country and probably a few other countries like it have done pretty well out of pandering to the older demographic. I think especially, perhaps a little less so in Australia because we have compulsory voting, but the tale in the US and the UK at a lot of elections over the last 2 decades is that the younger generation are less politically mobilised than the older generation. Therefore, you can go a long way indulging the economic interests of the older generation, ignoring that of the younger generation, and that this lies at the heart of a lot of economic inequalities and injustices within our society. Even with compulsory voting, though, I think the coalition in particular did very well. Electorally speaking, indulging the interests of people who owned property, who were retired, were living off superannuation. Their interests got indulged quite heavily by, I guess Labor can't be completely let off the hook here, but given that the Liberal Party have been in power for all but a handful of terms going back to 1996, you can blame them for practically anything going on in society, and feel pretty confident doing that. So what have I got here? An ANU study found, okay, so there's a clear distinction in terms of who it was who rebelled against the coalition. The ANU study found that about, I think it was 73% of people who voted coalition in 2019 stayed with them in 2022. Or to sort of put it more interestingly, 27% who voted for them did the opposite. It's sort of 25, 26, 27% of coalition voters from 2019 abandoned them in 2022, and that is too many if you want to win an election. It was particularly those under 55 who did so. The older voters, relatively speaking, stayed true, were relatively stable, did not abandon the Liberal Party from 2019 to 2022. How many people here had an awful feeling of deja vu early on election night and thought this isn't going very well? Right, okay. Well, I'm glad that I'm not imagining that. I live in my own little cocoon on election night, but I sort of had that sense that, all right, is this 2019 again? The reason for that is that older voters live in regional areas, in small towns. These are the first booths that report on election night. On election night, what we were seeing early on the night was the stickiness of the older voter. They were not moving. They were voting as they did in 2019. We weren't seeing big swings. We were also seeing Northern Tasmania, which was a story unto itself, because Northern Tasmania is, there's no big capital city there. We're talking about regional seats here. And there are a lot of marginal seats there, so a lot of the attention was on northern Tasmania. But northern Tasmania is a demographically old place. It's the kind of place that wasn't sticking. So early on election night, we were seeing results from places which weren't swinging much. And until the bigger booths started to come in from the cities, then we saw the havoc that had been unleashed on the coalition. And obviously later on in the night, Western Australia brought home the bacon as far as Labor was concerned. So I think we went through 3 phases on election night. Early on the night, it looked as though maybe Scott Morrison was pulling another rabbit out of the hat. Then we saw that no, actually, they were undergoing a major disaster in the big cities. Certainly, they were not going to retain their majority. And then phase 3, Western Australia swings more than anyone expected, and that pushes Labor over the line to a majority. That's all fabulous for the drama of election night, but in theory, I'm not supposed to care about the drama of election night. I'm looking at the demographics of the result. But Labor's biggest swings were in metropolitan seats that have become demographically younger over the past decade. There's another demographic thing going on in these seats, which I'll discuss shortly. But Chisholm, Bennelong and Reid, 3 seats that Labor gained from the Liberals, had an election where Labor didn't gain huge numbers of seats off the Liberals. You know, they did all right, but, you know, so many of the Liberals' losses weren't actually to Labor. But among the seats they did, in fact, lose to Labor, they are seats that have become distinctly demographically younger over the course of the last 2 census cycles. So there you've got your inner metropolitan areas, especially those seats swung heavily to Labor. Those are, you know, the demographic polar opposites of the sorts of areas that we were seeing early on election night. So only when big booths were coming in from the cities that we were seeing that the Liberals were doing very badly in inner metropolitan Sydney, in inner metropolitan Melbourne, not just in terms of the Teal independent contest, but badly enough to lose important seats to Labor like these ones. My next slide is about, as I've called it, the age property nexus. Obviously, older people own their homes, younger people don't, as well as not merely not owning their homes, they are struggling to get into the property market and they're increasingly angry about it. And that, I think, more than any single thing, if I had to put my finger on exactly what went wrong at this election, as I sort of said before, in relation to indulging the baby boomers over many decades, this is where that phenomenon finally found electoral expression and bit the coalition on the posterior, so to speak. So YouGov data shows that the coalition maintained over 40% support from homeowners over 35, but people who did not own their homes and again, I'm pretty sure this means that they're not in the property market at all. That means they don't have a mortgage either. In no income cohort did they exceed 26% of the vote. I think people who are very wealthy, we're talking about quite a small number of people who are very wealthy who aren't in the property market. But among those who are in that category, very few of them were voting coalition either. So if people were not in the property market, at every stage of the income scale, very few of them were voting for the coalition. Except this breaks down among people under 35 in the sense that whether or not they were in the property market under 35, they were not voting for the coalition. There was a youth rebellion against the coalition which cut across that property dimension. So property goes a long way towards explaining the election result, but age in and of itself was a strong factor. I think probably young people, even if they had made it into the property market, were probably quite bitter about the extent of the difficulty that they'd encountered getting there, and held the coalition responsible, and probably largely with good reason. So even among homeowners under 35, the combined Labor and Greens vote was more than double that of the coalition, which is pretty extraordinary, given how much I've emphasised that property clearly had a statistically measurable effect on the result. but it was overwhelmed by the age factor. So obviously you have difficulty disentangling age and property. Obviously there's a strong correlation between those two things, but age over and above property had its own effect. Perhaps relatedly, YouGov also suggested the traditional association between income and conservative voting was stronger among older voters. This is why I have included the chart that we have here. This is from YouGov's survey. It shows how the, I'll stick with the coalition to explain what's going on here. From left to right on the coalition, we have increasing income categories. So what we see, we've got three illustrations of the fact that as income increases, so the coalition vote increases. But they've broken this down to three different age cohorts. So the top darker line is older people, the somewhat lighter middle line is middle-aged people, and the faint bottom line is younger people. Among older and middle-aged people, we see a clear upward slope in that coalition line. So among older and middle-aged people, the coalition vote does what you would always traditionally expect it to do. As the income cohort increases, so increases the coalition vote. But when you get to the younger category and look across all four parties, you will see that there is a less distinct pattern among younger people. The income effect among younger people doesn't appear as strong as it does among people who have been voting for 40 or 50 years and have the strong sense that coalition are the party of the wealthy and Labor are the party of people who are struggling. Younger people are not responding to that dynamic so much, so I might hypothesize that what we see here is the seeds of a longer term breakdown in the association between wealth and income and how people are going to vote. Perhaps these younger people, as they get older, are going to continue to not respond so much to income and wealth as a cue to how they vote. And as the older generations fade away, maybe over time, that relationship will break down. But we're not there yet, and that may not be the case. It may be that younger people, as they get older, do suddenly, increasingly, not suddenly, over time, increasingly use the economic impetus as their cue for how they're going to vote. But at least one might hypothesize that what we are seeing here is that a new generation are coming through. They do not understand politics as a party politics as a class-based affair, socioeconomic class at least, and we're increasingly going to see a more sort of cultural than an economic divide between conservative and non-conservative voters. A comment that caught my eye, Gray Connolly, who's a bit of a sort of conservative philosophical culture warrior, wrote an article in the 9 newspapers, what you'd formerly call the Fairfax papers, criticising the coalition for having neglected the importance of home ownership, for having done what I criticised them myself for doing before, for having indulged the baby boomer property owning class so much that they're now left holding an empty bag. They do not have an emerging class of younger voters who own property. Robert Menzies was very keen on this. He wanted ordinary people to own their homes, felt that if they did, that they would become politically conservative. This was Gray Connolly's thesis, that the conservative, the Liberal Party these days has failed to cultivate home ownership, and now they are left with an electorate that doesn't have conservative economic values and is more than willing to abandon them. And, that they don't have that cultural bedrock that they have, and they're going to have a lot of trouble winning elections as a result. There is no future for conservatism unless people have something of their own to conserve. Okay, obviously a lot was said about the rebellion of women against the coalition, and particularly professional women. So much probably that I don't need to go into it any further, except to note that it wasn't Labor who principally yielded the dividend of this. The coalition vote did indeed plummet among women, and especially among the professional women, but Labor's vote did not increase. Labor's vote did not increase across the board. The cohorts that rebelled against the coalition, particularly women, went to the Greens and Independents. And, that goes a long way towards explaining the teal independent phenomenon. Or it would, if not for the awkward fact that Climate 200's polling showed that there was not a particularly big gender gap in the teal independent seats. Men and women in those seats, so far as the teal independents did just as well among men as they did among women in the seats that they won. The most significant demographic effects to explain the disparity of voting within the teal independent seats was once again education. There was a very strong education effect. Such people as live in the teal independent seats who do not have university degrees did not actually vote for them in large numbers. Older people relatively stuck to the Liberal Party up to a point, and religiosity, by which I mean it doesn't matter which religion you are, it matters whether you are religious or not. Older, more religious people, particularly on lower education, stuck with the Liberal Party in those seats. It was among the parts of the electorate who weren't like that the Liberal Party got skewered. Another important and significant demographic factor of this election was that there was a massive swing against the Liberals, clearly among voters of Chinese backgrounds. All that beating of the drum that Peter Dutton and others did to scare people into thinking that Labor were Manchurian candidates had no impact at all among the voters they were targeting, but had an extremely heavy impact upon voters of Chinese backgrounds, regardless of how they felt about the regime in Beijing. And I would like to give a round of applause to the Advance Australia movement, who I spent a lot of time in the Curtin electorate. They were driving their stupid billboards through the electorate showing Xi Jinping casting his ballot for the Labor Party. Don't give any money to Climate 200 or Get Up. Give your money to Advance Australia. I will do your cause better than any ostensibly progressive outfit conceivably could. They clearly don't do any market research. They just watch Sky News and think that it's real. And so, all right. I better get a move on. Okay, all right. So I mentioned earlier a bunch of seats that had gotten demographically younger. Those seats are also, and I'm not exactly sure how I can disentangle these two effects. They are also the heavily Chinese areas of Melbourne and Sydney in particular. And it's probable that the fact that there's been a dramatic infusion of people from China and like countries into these electorates that has changed their demographic profile. Also, there's a lot of talk about there are a lot of apartments growing in these sorts of areas that are bringing in sort of affluent young renters. But I don't know how much of these two different effects and to what extent that they're sort of entangling with each other and are hard to pull apart. But Chisholm, Bennelong and Reid, I mentioned before, are seats that had gotten demographically younger. They are also among the most heavily Chinese electorates in the country, and all of them were gained by Labor. Among the 10 seats with populations of Chinese language speakers, with the highest proportion thereof, there was a swing to Labor of nearly 7%, which was about double the national result. And in a bunch of other seats, Labor came very close to winning the seats of Deakin and Menzies in Melbourne. Menzies is a seat that Labor have never won before. That sort of area of eastern Melbourne, there has been a huge influx of people from Chinese backgrounds over the last decade, and that really kicked hard and very nearly won Labor a few extra seats, which I don't think they were expecting to win. So I think that was a particularly forceful effect. Okay, obviously there's been a lot of talk about, have we seen the end of the two-party system? I'm sceptical that you can go that far. Apparently, I heard sort of Malcolm Turnbull suggest that he thinks we're going the way of Germany and that we're moving towards a multi-party democracy. I don't think that's the case, purely because we have a single member electoral system and they have proportional representation one. Nonetheless, we're obviously going to see a lot more hung parliaments in future. And I think the point that I would like to make here above all is that there is a large proportion of the electorate that will respond to a strong independent candidate, to a minor party challenge where one gains a bit of steam, where that happens. So as a result, at this election, you know, we saw seats with similar demographic profiles behaving very differently purely on the basis of who was and wasn't running there. Higgins, Labor won Higgins because there happened not to be a strong Teal independent emerge there. The Greens won the seat of Ryan in Brisbane, probably because a strong Teal independent didn't emerge there. By that purely random factor of chance, you know, Labor won one seat, the Greens won another seat. So we saw a lot of result that was simply contingent upon which kinds of candidates didn't emerge. And this potentially gives you a warning for Labor. Labor obviously lost the seat of Fowler. Christina Keneally, a strong independent, emerged to challenge her. People responded to that. That was probably, you know, obviously there's a lesson to be drawn there, that it's a very dangerous thing to do in this environment, to parachute in a candidate who doesn't seem to have any kind of demographic affinity with that electorate. It also shows that what you imagine to be a safe electorate, this is not purely a lesson for the Liberal Party. It is also the case that seats that have traditionally been regarded as safe, unlosable Labor seats, they're not safe Labor seats, they're seats the Liberals can't win. That's the lesson that we need to draw here, that, you know, given we don't have proportional representation, the decline of major party voting is going to manifest in unpredictable ways. The ANU study found that the largest movement in voting attention during the campaign, it was from Labor to the Greens. So Labor's win, I think, was baked in before the election campaign began. I don't think Labor had a particularly brilliant election campaign. They had won the election before the campaign period began. And in fact, the biggest traffic within the campaign itself, Labor did not gain on the Liberals during the campaign. There was, as the ANU study found, roughly equal numbers of voters defected from Labor to Liberal as vice versa. The most significant movement was that the Greens picked up votes from Labor. I think Adam Bandt's Google it mate line was a good fillip for his campaign. And I think the fact that, you know, Labor were pursuing their small target strategy, it succeeded in avoiding scaring the horses and, you know, keeping economically conservative voters on board, but it did also result in disaffection on the left of politics, which is, you know, a familiar theme over the years. A point that I did want to make earlier on, yes, Labor have won seats they've never won before. They've won Higgins, they've won Boothby, never ever won those seats before. On the other hand, they didn't win seats that they normally win at a winning election. As a matter of fact, they didn't win seats that they won in 2016. Petrie in Brisbane, Longman in Brisbane. Longman was a seat that Labor won in 2016. Lindsay in Sydney was a seat that Labor won in 2016. The 2016 election, when the Liberals were led by Malcolm Turnbull, was a kind of reversion to type. Because the Liberals had a, you know, ideologically moderate leader who had a, you know, image as being a silvertail, that meant that at that election we saw a reversion to voting patterns typical of, you know, past times. With Malcolm Turnbull out of the way, the Liberal Party recovered those two seats and they held on to them this time. Labor put a lot of energy over into the years to fretting about Lindsay, but we've now proved that Labor can win an election without winning Lindsay. And Petrie was another seat that Labor held throughout the Rudd Gillard years, Page in northern New South Wales. There were a couple of them around the place that were seats Labor held, even at some quite mediocre or worse elections. Labor did not win this time, and they are on those metropolitan fringes. So that has led to a culture war within the Liberal Party, even before the election result. What do we do here? Do we take the Teals on? Do we moderate ourselves to recover the faith of the seats that we're losing to the Teals? Or do we say, forget it, they're all sandal-wearing tofu munchers, as someone put it in some Liberal apparatchik put it off the record in the Australian, and we should abandon those seats? That tends to be the view on the right of the Liberal Party. We don't need these Chardonnay socialists. We can find new demographics, and Britain and America show us the way. If there was in the last election in Britain, the Conservative Party knocked over the so-called Red Wall. They won seats in northern England on the back of pro-Brexit sentiment, which had always been working class Labor seats. Donald Trump has brought to the Republican Party a demographic of low-income white voters, and the notion within the Liberal Party is that this is where the future lies. We need to abandon those voters who have abandoned us. Is that feasible? It doesn't seem to me that it is. I'm struggling to see the seats that are actually going to be credibly won by the Liberal Party on this basis. Hunter, the coal mining seat in New South Wales, Labor got a bit of a fright there in 2019. Maybe electorates like that in regional areas are going to continue moving away from Labor. I could give you a long list of regional seats that used to be pretty strong for Labor, where now they just don't win them at all. And Hunter might well join that list. But when you actually move into the cities, it's very hard to see the seats that the Liberal Party are going to win to compensate for all of this. Now, that almost brings me to an end. Can we just sort of flick through my pretty little heat maps? This shows where the swing happened. Don't worry about that. Move back 2 slides. Yeah, that'll do. So here we've got swing maps of Sydney and Brisbane, and if it's blue, it swung to Liberal. If it's red, it swung to Labor. So we see a few manifestations of the Liberal Party actually doing pretty well in outer suburbia here. The electorate on the far left in Sydney is Lindsay. We've got a mix of red and blue there, so that seat didn't swing. Consequently, Labor didn't win it. And in the sort of more populous areas of southwestern Sydney, there are some quite substantial swaths of blue there. And there's a very deep bit of blue in the electorate of Fowler, which was where Christina Keneally lost her seat. On the contrary, in the affluent parts of Sydney, in northern Sydney especially, that's affluent territory, even where Labor wasn't winning these seats, they were picking up very big swings. Warringah is a little bit blue. I think that's because there was such a locally specific backlash against Tony Abbott personally there in 2019, and that came off this time. So Warringah off on the coast there didn't really, I doubt that people were responding to Catherine Deeves, but nonetheless, there it is. One day I will find out why Northern Greenway swung heavily to Labor, but that's a little bit esoteric. I don't need to go into that. Brisbane, again, same pattern. You've got a few clumps in outer Brisbane where the coalition actually did rather well. And in the north, the northern seat there is Longman. That is the Brisbane equivalent of Lindsay, a seat that you'd think Labor would win at a good election, which they didn't win. So in, again, outer urban areas, Labor not doing so well. Final slide. Melbourne, and this is something that I skipped over on my previous slide. Labor are coming off a high base in Melbourne. This needs to be acknowledged, but especially in Melbourne, in outer urban areas, and this is a bit of a warning sign for Daniel Andrews. I'm not saying I expect him to lose, but I do expect him to take a haircut in suburban Melbourne, and particularly in Western and sort of southeastern suburban Melbourne. We see a good deal of blue there. But on the other hand, we see an awful lot of red in the inner urban core. That was where Labor won Chisholm. That was where the Teal Independents did their damage. And I would suggest that that wraps it up. So thank you very much for paying attention.